No Democrat has a sinful nature. Now, in this present political climate, it is very hard to believe that. In fact, I almost would convert to the idea that Democrats do in fact have sinful natures. Anybody that would be for killing babies got something terribly wrong with them. Anybody that would be for the promotion of sodomy has something terribly wrong with them. Anybody that would smear a good man like they've done has something terribly wrong with them. But, biblically speaking, no Democrat has a sinful nature, and neither do the Republicans nor anyone else. In fact, there's no such thing as a sinful nature, not anywhere in the universe, ever. Not before, since, or after. It doesn't exist. It's an oxymoron. It cannot happen. A sinful nature would require a sinful God to create one, and he has not done that, nor will he. You are at the door tonight. Michael Pearl is teaching you. That's me. And we are No Greater Joy Ministries. You can find us at nogreaterjoy.org. Now, we're going to be investigating an absurdity tonight, the fourth time around. It is totally absurd. No one has a free will, and all fetuses are abominable in God's sight. That's the absurdity we're investigating. It's called Calvinism. No one has a free will, and all fetuses are abominable in the sight of God. That's called original sin in all your theology books and your liturgies. The sinful nature is represented as a resident antagonist to all man's endeavors and evil force, the dark side stealing our intentions, enslaving our will. It's like this. Don't blame me. My nature comes from God. I'm just fulfilling his will. There's this evil self, this antagonist that lives within. He makes me do things I don't want to do. I was born with it. God created me that way. Now, the Bible says, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. That's the way I feel answering Calvinism. I feel like I'm answering a fool. Answer a fool, though, according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. In other words, to enter in, I feel like I'm stooping down to enter even into a discussion with a Calvinist. It's such absurd, anti-biblical, anti-human, offense to God doctrine. But, lest they go on in their foolishness, we'll have to get down there and answer it, which we've been doing. Now, total depravity is a new doctrine. Now, by total depravity, you understand we're talking about the use of it the way the Calvinists use it, which means depravity of human nature, that every aspect of the human body, soul, spirit, mind is depraved and incapable of doing anything right or good, incapable even of making a choice to receive God. Total depravity, that's the way it is viewed in the books. So it was a doctrine developed about 500 years ago based on old Gnosticism, which is, won't go into it, but a earlier heresy. Now, 5th century Augustine is the first one to begin this crazy belief. Augustine was a philosopher in his day, very brilliant, intelligent man, as most philosophers are. And Augustine of Hippo says, everyone bears guilt which he incurs at birth and is in the bonds of inherited guilt. Inherited guilt? That means that when you're born, you're already guilty for something. That's totally strange altogether. They're punished, he says, not only on account of the sins which they have, which they add by their indulgence. Now, he's talking about children here. They're punished not only on account of the sins which they add by the indulgence of their own will, but on account of the original sin, even if, as in the case of infants, they have added nothing to that original sin. Now, this is my definitive view on the question, so that the hidden things of God may keep their secret without impairing my own faith. Every Calvinist who's seriously involved in it ends up having a crisis of faith just to believe what they believe. Luther confessed that he went in depression with his own doctrine, found it hard to believe. And why they hang on to it when it's so unbiblical is beyond me, except it's a way of escaping responsibility and accountability. So Martin Luther, later in 1483, went back and dug up Augustine. If you read his book, Bondage to the Will, you will see that it 2 or 3, 4, 5 times on every page he makes a reference to Augustine. He says, for if man has lost his freedom, which they teach, and is forced to serve sin, which they teach, and cannot will good, which they teach, what conclusion can more justly be drawn concerning him than that he sins and wills evil necessarily? Now that means that it's necessary for everyone that's born to do evil all the time without exception. It is absolutely, by your nature, it's necessary. Like alarm clock set at 6 o'clock, by nature, makes a little ringing sound at 6 o'clock. Now, John Calvin came along right behind Luther, and he is the one who really perfected this doctrine, created what's called the Reformed religion, and that's where it gets its term Calvinism. Original sin, therefore, appears to be a hereditary depravity and corruption of our nature, diffused through all the parts of the soul, rendering us obnoxious to the divine wrath and producing in us those works which the Scripture calls works of the flesh. So Calvin on infants, this is what I didn't make this up. This is what Calvin said about that cute little baby right there. For although they have not yet produced the fruits of their own unrighteousness, they have the seed implanted in them. No, their whole nature is, as it were, a seedbed of sin, and therefore cannot but be odious and abominable to God. So Calvin says that the infants are odious and abominable to God. Therefore, Calvin believes that the fetuses being aborted in the abortion clinics are odious and abominable to God. That means God sides with the abortionist. He sides with the mothers who want to kill their babies, according to the Calvinist. Now, if these odious and abominable unto God infants and fetuses die, where would they go? According to Calvinists, they go to hell. Now, you see why I feel like a fool even addressing this subject? You think, well, who in the world would believe any of that? About 90% of Christianity, non-Catholic Christianity, it is the popular doctrine. When I went to Bible college, that's what we studied, Calvinism. I read the theology books. I didn't believe it then. I answered the questions, did real well in theology. That's my best subject. But I thought, this is crazy. Now, there's a great book called What Love Is This, written by Dave Hunt. It's an old book now, and I looked online today, and you can get them for $6 in hardback. Big old thick book like that. Been about a $30 book when it first came out. It's been out for 15, 20 years. But if you want to get that book right there, you will find everything you need to know about Calvinism and answers to it. What love is this? Now, the subject of it is he's challenging, how could there be any love of God in Calvinism? How could God be a God of love if Calvinism is true? Now here's Charles G. Finney. Finney has said some things heretical, but he said some things so well and so good, better than anyone else has ever said them. So I'm quoting him. That doesn't mean I support everything Finney says, but I support what he says here because he's correct. If the child has a sinful nature, it is his misfortune and not his crime. Constituted as we are, it is impossible that we should condemn ourselves for a sinful nature or for actions that are unavoidable. How do you feel guilty for doing what you ought to do? For if you are necessarily a sinner and compelled to do so, how would you feel guilty for doing it? What responsibility would you have in the act? None at all. Charles Finney also said, for in fact, if this doctrine is true, he is not to blame for being a sinner any more than he's to blame for being a human being. If all this is true, the sinner's case is infinitely hard, and God would appear the most unreasonable and cruel of beings if he did not provide for their escape. That means all of them, not electing some and not electing. In fact, God becomes more abominable if he can elect any to salvation, and he chooses to only elect a small portion and not elect the rest. No wonder Hollywood and atheists and college people make fun of Christianity if this is the picture presented. Calvinists boast of a low view of man and a high view of God. Everything they do is based around the idea of a sovereign God being exalted above all and man being low, low, low indeed. Now, Charles Finney said, if men are without excuse for sin, as the whole law and gospel assume and teach, it cannot possibly be that their nature is sinful. For a sinful nature would be the best of all excuses for sin. I actually heard that excuse for sin quite a few times. This doctrine is a stumbling block both to the church and the world, infinitely dishonorable to God, and an abomination alike to God and the human intellect, and should be banished from every pulpit and from every formula of doctrine. When Finney was preaching, Calvinism ruled everywhere in every church around him. He was considered a really radical heretic, and he did get radical on a few points. And from the world, it is a relic of heathen philosophy, which I showed you a while ago, and was fostered in among the doctrines of Christianity by Augustine, as everyone may know who will take the trouble to examine it for himself. Now, after Augustine, by the way, he was counted a heretic, Augustine. And the church did not follow his teachings. The Roman Catholic Church followed some of them. They came up with the doctrines of purgatories and things like that from Augustine. No hell. But the doctrine of human nature, the church never followed it. Total depravity actually elevates man by divesting him of the responsibility for sin. They take a low view of man, but then they elevate him by taking away the responsibility for sin, and I say taking away his guilt. According to the sinful nature doctrine, it is natural to sin and unnatural to do righteousness. Totally natural to sin. I'm normal, just a living according to my nature. No guilt, no shame, no conflict. I am all that God made to be, said the queer. God made me this way. That's just who I am. This guy, he likes putting on women's clothes and putting on makeup and going down to the roadside stops and picking up somebody at the urinal. God made him that way. That's his nature. That's the way he is. And no need to feel guilty about it. He's just doing what he was created to do. I guess I'm the pervert then because I want to please God, this guy said. And he would be a pervert if he wanted to please God. Because the Calvinist said he can't want to please God. It's impossible for him to. That's strange. I say these things and I think, are people going to believe they actually believe that when it comes out of my mouth? Me too. I don't like doing evil. I've always tried to be a good person. He's not saved yet, but he's tried to be a good person. He's eschewed a lot of evil in his life. He's avoided over-drinking, avoided parties where there was immorality going about. He's avoided stealing. He tries to treat his neighbors well. He's been philanthropic. He has been a good man who's worked and taken care of his wife and his children, doesn't go to church, but he sought to live like a man ought to live before God. There's millions like that out here in this country. They're not righteous. They're unholy, but they have done some good things. They have made choices. For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that do I. If I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. Now, the Calvinists would point to that and say, see, there's a sinful nature. I point to it and say that's the opposite of a sinful nature. This guy would not do evil. He's chosen well. He's chosen rightly. He would do the right thing. But he finds a law of sin working in his members, in his flesh, causing him to act contrary to how he would like to act. You know, hypocrites prove that no one has a sinful nature. The presence of hypocrites. What are they trying to do? They're trying to be righteous and appear righteous. Why? Because they know it's the right thing to do. They're not born to prefer sin. They're born to prefer righteousness. So universal guilt disproves total depravity. You know, if we have a sinful nature and somehow accidentally we did something good, we'd feel guilty about it. because we live in contrary to our nature. Universal guilt disproves total depravity. I tried to please the Great Spirit, but I know I have failed, I'm afraid. When you go to foreign tribes, you find them with a sense of God, of the Great Spirit, and of right and wrong, of not doing evil, of trying to get themselves ready for life after death, of fearing the consequences of the life they've lived. How could you say their natures are evil? So let's open the Bible and see what it's got to say. Romans 2. Now this is a great passage here. For the Gentiles which have not the law. Now Gentile was a non-Jew, not exposed to Moses, did not have the law of God, did not have a Bible. The Gentiles which have not the law do by nature, okay, here we got the word nature. 12 times it's found in the Bible. They're going to do by nature some really evil things, right? Because that's what nature does. That's what human nature is about. They do by nature the things contained in the law. Here's a person that doesn't know God, not saved, not a Christian, not a Jew, not exposed to the Bible, and he just does what's natural to him, and what's natural is to do the law of God. These having not the law are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts. There is something written in the heart of man called the law of God. How could that be if he was totally depraved? How could the sacred, holy law of God be written in his heart so clearly that he attempts to do it? Their conscience also bearing witness. That means the conscience chooses right, knows right, hates wrong, fears wrong, is guilty about wrong. Their conscience also bearing witness in their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. That means the heathen without God, without the Bible, in a mental process of evaluating the actions of everybody around them and either condone or condemn the actions of other people according to whether or not they're good or bad, sinful or righteous. I mean, that's enough right there to totally dismiss the doctrine of Calvinism, and we haven't got started good yet. Let no man say when he's tempted, I'm tempted of God. All right? For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. He just gave them a sinful nature where they can't do anything but evil, right? It's amazing you never find that in the Bible. If every man is tempted, but when every man is tempted, when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So he's describing how sin goes. A man has a lust, and it draws him away. He's enticed, and when lust hath conceived, it brings forth sin. The sin comes about in this adult man's life as a result of his own personal lust. And sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. And death is a result in that man's life of his personal sin. Here'd be a good place to inject Adam's sin into it. Here'd be a good place to say, well, he's going to go to hell anyhow because he's already got Adam's guilt on him, and this doesn't add anything to it whatsoever. I mean, you can only be, there's not hell number 1, 2, or 3. James 1, do not err, my beloved brethren, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Now, this is the flow of the text from one we just read. Let's go back. See, that's 13, 14, 15. The text continues. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. You see, that's what comes down from God is good things, not sinful nature. He doesn't tempt us to sin. He's not providing that we should be nothing but sinners. God is providing good things coming down from heaven. The early church fathers universally rejected the concept of total depravity. I'm going to read it to you. Nothing like a good history book. Justin Martyr, 100 to 165 A.D., famous early church father, did a lot of writing. We've got copies of some of it. Let some suppose, from what has been said by us, that we say that whatever occurs happens by a fatal necessity. You see, the Stoics, the Greeks, different ones, had that philosophy of fatal necessity. Because it is foretold as known beforehand, which two we explain. What he's saying is some people say, well, since everything's known beforehand by God, and everything is predetermined, then there's this fate. It will come about as it's intended to come about, and therefore we can't help it when we sin. We have learned from the prophets, and we are told, we hold it to be true, that punishments, chastisements, and good rewards are rendered according to the merit of each man's actions. Now, if this is not so, but all things happen by fate, then neither is anything at all in our own power. Calvin would have had a hard time. For if it is predetermined that this man will be good and this other man will be evil, Calvinism, neither is the first one meritorious, nor the latter man to be blamed. Sound like Finney there. And again, unless the human race has the power of avoiding evil and choosing good by free choice, they are not accountable for their actions. Sounds like Finney again. That's first century. John the Apostle died about the year this guy was born. And he took up the message. Now there are others, many, many others. I'm skipping quite a few here. 130 to 202. But man, being endowed with reason, and in this respect similar to God, having been made free in his will and with power over himself, is himself his own cause that sometimes he becomes wheat and sometimes chaff. He's saying that men become wheat or chaff not at birth, but by their own free choice and actions. Diametrically opposed to Calvinism. This is what sane people have believed in the church throughout all the ages. Tertullian, 160, 225 A.D. Another early church father, a lot of which we know his writings. I find then that man was constituted free by God. He was master of his own will and power, for a law would not be imposed upon one that did not have it in his power to render that obedience which is due to law. God wouldn't give us a law and say, this do and thou shalt live. Don't do it and you'll die, if there was no power in us to do it. Nor again would the penalty of death be threatened against sin if a contempt of the law were impossible to man in the liberty of his will. Man is free with a will either for obedience or resistance. You Calvinists make it too easy for us Bible believers. Now, this is Andrew Wallace and Rusk. The Christian church in the 2nd century A.D. had nothing resembling the doctrine of original sin as many post-Reformation Christians know it today. The apostolic fathers had little to say on the subject. Only Barnabas and the apostolic fathers referenced the fall, and he believed that children were born sinless. Hey, Mike Pearl believes that. Universally, that children are born innocent of the sin of Adam, that people incur guilt only for their own sins, and that every person has the God-given power of free will to do good or evil. That's so obvious. The farmer on the tractor never reads anything. You get him off the tractor, he knows this. This is what universally is understood in the whole world. Sin is not the absence of something, like the Spirit of God, our good nature. Sin is not the absence of something. It is an irresponsible act willfully committed or indifference selfishly motivated. Sin is an act contrary to human nature. That's the key. It is contrary to human nature. That's what makes it sinful. Sin is an act or attitude that is by nature harmful. You see, it's not sin because God says it's sin. God says it's sin because it is. It being contrary to human nature and divine nature, it is therefore out of order, it's chaotic, it is destructive, and it is sin. Like putting sugar in a gas tank. That by nature will destroy your gasoline engine, so you don't do that. As long as you put gasoline in your gasoline engine, by nature it runs fine. So let's open the Bible and read again. Whosoever committeth sin transgresses also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law. It's not what Adam did, it's what transgressing the law. Christ's humanity disproves total depravity. This is good and very easy. Only pick easy subjects. For verily, he took not on him the nature of angels, Jesus, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. Wherefore in all things it behooved him, Jesus, to be made like unto his brethren, in all things made like unto his brethren. Jesus took on humanity. Was Jesus both God and man? Was he completely man? He had to be completely man in order to be an atonement for us. Did Jesus get tempted in all points like as we are? If he was tempted, then he had a human nature capable of temptation. If he had a human nature capable of temptation, he was just like Adam, because Adam had a human nature capable of temptation. Wherefore in all things it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, and to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. 2 Corinthians 5, for he hath made him to be sin for us who knew no sin. So Jesus, this man, made like men, did not have a sinful nature. If we have a sinful nature, he would have had to have one as well. Knew no sin. Philippians 2, who being in the form of God, Jesus, thought it not robbery to be equal. In other words, he didn't think he would be cheating if he stayed in the Godhead condition, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Jesus bled like a man. He died like a man. He grew weary like a man, and sat down on a well to get a drink of water like a man, because he was a man of flesh, just as you and I are. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law. We did that one, their conscience. How'd that get down there again? Somebody's messing with my slide. Condemnation is due to the choices one makes, not something our fathers did. Condemnation is due to the choices one makes, not something our fathers did. Look at this. This is good. Jeremiah 31:29. In those days they shall say no more, the fathers have eaten a sour grape, and the children's teeth are set on edge. But every one shall die for his own iniquity, and every man that eateth the sour grape, his teeth shall be set on edge. Look at this. Daddy must be eating sour grapes at work again. So he's brushing his teeth. What happened? Well, you know, father did it, and the son gets the results. Consequences can be secondhand of an action. In other words, you can get drunk and have a wreck and kill someone else. They can suffer the consequences of your actions. But blameworthiness cannot be secondhand. The only one to blame is the one that is guilty, who did something out of order, untoward. That's the guilty person. So the consequences of what Adam did, and we're going to cover that later, not tonight, which brought death, physical death on the human race, we inherit the consequences of separation from God and death. We do not inherit the blame for what Adam did. Behold, all souls are mine, as the soul of the Father, so the soul of the Son is mine. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. That's pretty clear. But if a man be just and do that which is lawful and right, now he's talking about unregenerate people in the Old Testament, didn't have the Holy Spirit, hath walked in my statutes, hath kept my judgments to deal truly, he is just, he shall surely live, saith the Lord God. Boy, somebody should have told God about that sinful nature business and total depravity and inability to make a choice, because he's challenging these people to do something that'll cause them to live. Paul viewed sin as a product of one's own history, not as a condition of birth. This is so clear all through the epistles. I'm going to read a longer passage here. Just not going to take the time to explain it all. Go back to my Romans series on YouTube, and you can get this in detail. But just notice as we read this, how much Paul assumes the responsibility is the man's. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of the men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, is it good to hold the truth? Can a person who is totally depraved hold the truth? He said they do. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. So there's a light of God inside this reprobate sinner. For God showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by things that are made. So people look at nature and know God, even his eternal power and Godhead. So they're without excuse. In other words, they would have an excuse if they didn't see these things. They would have an excuse if there was not that revelation internally. They would have an excuse if God was not there and there was an option to choose. They would have an excuse, just as Finney said they would. But he said no. They are now without excuse, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, became vain in their imaginations, and the foolish heart was darkened. How would you darken a heart that was born black? How would you darken a heart that was born without any light? Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. The fool process happened in real time as they made choices, and changed the glory which they saw and knew of the uncorruptible God into an image made like an corruptible man, birds, four-footed beasts, and three creeping things, wherefore God also gave them up. According to the Calvinists, we're born given up. He gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, not some precondition imposed upon them, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie and worship and serve the creature more than the Creator, who's blessed forever. For this cause, God gave them up. Again, further step down, unto vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use of that which is against nature. He's talking about women with women, lesbianism, two women having sex. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burning their lust one toward another. If you've been in a roadside stop, you've seen that. Men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. He said something happens, and I found out recently what it is. Their brains are changed. It alters the brain, the neurons, the synapse, when they commit those kinds of sins. It creates a degradation in their brain. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, I wouldn't either if I was queering around. God gave them over to reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient. So their mind gets changed into a reprobate. That's something that is totally becomes devoid of truth and light in God. So how would you develop a reprobate mind through an earthly process if you're born with a reprobate mind? Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whispers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death. Why are they worthy of death? Because they committed something. They did an act. See, the whole Bible reads that way. And to come along and say that we're born damned because of something somebody else did, and born incapable of choosing God or making a right choice, is contrary to Scripture, plain sense, reason, logic, humanity, and deity altogether. So there's no such thing as a sinful nature, just sinful intent, sinful choice, sinful neglect, and sinful indifference. Finally, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them, are sent unto thee, stonest them which are sent unto thee. Now, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chicks under wings, and ye would not? Jesus said he desired to gather them together, to heal them, to love them, but they would not. He lays the blame on them. He would be extremely cruel to be talking this way if they're all previously damned for Adam's sin, and the only ones that won't be are those that he decides to save, and the others he decides not to. And here he is talking like they could actually do something, like they could actually make a choice, and like the responsibility was theirs. That would be a cruel, mean God. All right, that's all for tonight, and we're not through yet. I'll tell you what we're going to do next time. I believe it'll be next time. We're going to go into how do you account for universal sin if there is no sinful nature. And that's going to be fun, too. So that's all for tonight.